Okay, so, and this one's called Negotiating the Speece by Leah and Martin. So, and this is a paper that's basically about the consistent framing of Euro-Western worldview and presenting of Indigenous artistic production in the country under that Eurocentric view, and how that has developed alongside other aspects of Eurocentric study without recognition of Indigenous arts in general, unless it's framed as primitive art. So the thesis here is, I think it's pretty clearly stated, like, that the legacy of colonialism continues to inform the scholarship and presentation of Aboriginal art histories and contemporary art practices, and the need remains for public institutions to strengthen their commitment to Indigenous art beyond the targeted funding initiatives. So it's basically for the Institute to present a full history and not just colonial history. It has to become more inclusionary of Indigenous art histories and contemporary mainstream galleries in Canada. So it goes about finding out why Indigenous art has really had little attention and has been mostly excluded from mainstream galleries, and it's found that there's really been no commitment at all to Indigenous art, like via collecting or whatnot. So, and it looks back through history to examine this. So we're talking about like the late 19th century, and it's looking into the relationships between anthropology and like art history and museology and ethnography and Indigenous arts at that time. So and it found that basically a lot of Indigenous objects were classified as like artifacts rather than as art, to promote to sort of create a sense of like inferiority or a justification for colonialist intervention. So it's a positioning, and as the museum developed in the late 19th and early 20th century, it became sort of entwined with this history through this type of categorization and study of art as objects through anthropology and ethnography. So it became a house basically that promoted these values of colonialism, and the spectator could come and experience these objects under a European value system. So you're sort of able to take this like shallow dive into the world of so-called primitive art, where objects are there for aesthetic pleasure and don't have to be really considered any further than that. At the same time, you have scholarship that develops under this system, this Euro-Western system that kind of works in conjunction with other classification systems to like limit and label Indigenous art under this like kind of reductionist framework. And at times these were oppositional frameworks, and we've seen that before in like some of our very earliest readings. At times they do come into opposition. So you have like these museums increasing visibility under reductionist scientific investigation, and the art historian is then reducing other work to exotic aesthetic pleasure that is divorced from culture and history. So they kind of work together too in that way to exclude Indigenous culture. Another factor in the exclusion practice was this notion of authenticity in objects. So, and this applies to works that were, like as described by the article, created early in a particular historic tradition and thus free from Euro influences. And this was basically a way for Europeans to maintain this belief that Indigenous people were primitive or less than them, or to basically maintain this also like this unrealistic version of Indigenous purity as well. So it disregards the reality of Indigenous people's history alongside European history as well, like our history together, shared history. And I think that this notion of authenticity and quality could be one of the more harmful ones, actually, because it basically completely disregards any cultural perspective and therefore potential for transformation at all. it's a very disconnected way of seeing things that becomes more disconnected as it goes. And basically all these things are continuing today because it's a Euro-Western concept that has been prepared with all of these supporting frameworks. And it also talks about the ease of the museum to reclassify art in order to allow for more investigation by the Euro artist. So it privileges the Euro artist in that way, which is also excluding the indigenous artists. So this reinforces issues of the primitive versus the modern through classification of previously studied scientific artifact as art. So now they can debate it as primitive or modern or whatever they want. So in these sorts of examples of Euro-Western frameworks, like the Group of Seven embracing indigenous art and regurgitating it in a Euro-Canadian method under nationalism, you can really get a sense of how complex the structure is and how these seemingly major changes are actually just methods of reinforcing other parts of the framework when those parts begin to feel an instability. And so the instability almost gets swallowed by the framework itself and recycled into another part of the structure to maintain its power. It's a way that presents through modernism as singularity and also gives the museum the ability to emancipate objects from their cultural context in order to maintain the Euro-Western structure. So it's pretty crafty. And it's very problematic and requires a commitment to change from the institution to art historians, in educational institutions, to scholarship. And scholarship is imperative because it's able to address these inequities in Western frameworks of authority. And so this is an imperative thing to be able to conceptualize a native aesthetic within these institutions. So it's more of a redefinition or a reclassification. This basically means changing the processes of inequality that exist within the gallery institution. And it talks about, on the last page, about strategies that pose complex challenges to Eurocentric parameters for curatorial and institutional practices. So it requires art galleries to engage in this self-critical process that requires basically a full overhaul, really, of how we examine and understand indigenous art. Because to bring the gallery into a more realistic mode of understanding and describing art requires more than just its institutional framework. It requires acknowledgement and understanding of the full implication of Euro-Western frameworks and authorship as the context of the gallery, or in the context of the gallery. So addressing and changing the privilege that exists in all of these seemingly outlying areas that are actually intertwined with the institution itself could possibly make a difference, but it seems like a very large problem. But yeah, so those are my two readings. Thanks. See you in class.